want to follow along, I have the Maya file I've been working on. If you go to the syllabus section of Blackboard Learn, general info, sample models, Maya files, and it's this robot caricature 5. If you dump it into Maya, it should be this hideous little thing that I've been doing. All right, so this is just gonna be a really basic intro of basically the fundamentals of parts of a rig, basically, and how joints work in Maya, how to set some up on your robot, and I'll go over a little bit about how joint stuff is sort of calculated. Those of you that had me last quarter, this is pretty much just a review of the stuff that I went through, but I know not everyone had me and not everyone covers rigging in Animation 1, so we're just gonna run through it again, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So, basic premise of rigging is that you need some kind of geometry, in this case, whatever I have here, clearly unfinished, and you need something to control or drive that geometry. So if you're thinking of this in terms of a human body, there's kind of 3 things that make it work. You have the flesh on the outside that kind of looks pretty and holds everything together, in which case kind of this geometry functions as that. You have bones, which means we're not just weird floppy things laying on the ground. We have some rigidity in our arms and our legs. That's going to be, in Maya, it's literally just also called joints. And then you have controllers, which in this case is just NURBS curves for a rig in your body. That would be kind of sort of the muscles that are actually driving and controlling how your bones move. So that's just sort of if you want to relate it to the human body, that's usually how I think about it. But let's just jump in and start talking about some actual rigging stuff. So if you go out of your modeling tab, just go into rigging and go into the skeleton tab if you're following along and do create joints. So this is one of those things where mercifully, usually you don't need to open this extra menu except maybe for some aesthetics. But let's just create some joints and see what we get. So pretty much it's going to ask you to click somewhere on the grid, and based on where you click, wherever you click, it's going to dump one of these little joints. When you're done with your joint chain, just hit enter, and it'll sort of finalize that. But you see we have this weird sort of snake of different pieces of stuff and joints just sort of connecting to each other in the order, that we drew them. So if you go and you open up your outliner, you'll notice that this joint chain that we've created, I'll do Shift P to expand that whole thing, or Shift click to expand that whole thing. It's laid out starting from the first one we made, which is this one, all the way through the last joint as a giant hierarchy. And the hierarchy is kind of important because that's how the computer knows which things should be connected to each other and how things are going to move. So you'll notice that it basically works like basic parenting would. If you ever parented a bunch of objects to each other, behaves pretty much the same way. So if I grab joint 3 and I rotate that around, it's going to take everything else with it, et cetera, right on down the line. So based on, there's a few different ways that you can edit joints. I feel the easiest is to just go into your outliner because you have this really obvious visual of how things are laid out. So if I grab joint 6 and I unparent that, so I'll just do Shift P as the hotkey, you'll notice that when I do that, it started its own hierarchy. So now there's nothing under joint 5. That's just sort of the last one in the little chain. And joint 6 is now the start of its own hierarchy. And it's just been completely disconnected from the first set of joints. So if you need to reorder joints or get rid of joints, that's usually how I do it. If I just needed to get rid of joint 6, what I could do at this point is take joint 7 and just middle mouse drag that under joint 5 in my outliner. And you can see that joint 5 is now connected directly to joint 7, and joint 6 is just sort of here, sad on its own in the corner. At which point, if you wanted to, you could delete it if that was your goal. You could also attach it somewhere else in the joint chain. I could put that also under joint 5. And you can see now that if I click on joint 5, it's going to control basically these 2 little arms of this rig. So if I move this, it's gonna take all of this with me at the same time. Any questions so far? Cool. So that's pretty much how you set up joints. You can move them and reshape them however you want. This is a very, very useful hotkey when you're doing rigging. So you'll notice right now if I want to move this joint up, it takes everything else with it. If you just want to adjust like a single joint in a chain and you don't want to have to readjust everything else, if you press and hold D, like D as in dog, it will let you move just that one joint. It's going to leave everything else where it is. So that's really helpful. Again, that's just pressing and holding the D key. It could potentially save you a lot of like twiddling with joints unnecessarily. All right. So the other thing that's important to know, and I will probably say this like 8,000 more times, when you are creating skeletons for rigging, under no circumstance should your joints ever have rotation on them. And that includes -0. And it's a weird thing Maya does. If you see -0, put it back to +0, question mark. But like I said, under no circumstances should your joints have rotation values on them. Translate values is fine. They're pretty much always going to have translate values. It's how it figures out where they are in space and how long they are. Does anybody remember the difference between world and local space by chance? Okay. So I feel like it's not like inherently important for rigging, but it is kind of helpful to just like remember that this is a thing that you can do. So I'm just going to make a cube and a sphere. They're gorgeous. Hooray. Interesting. I have made a peppermint patty, or a Mento. We're going to go with it. All right, so you'll notice that when I make these, like obviously these both have translation values on them, and some really weird scale values. If I take this cube and I just go ahead and zero out the translation values, it snaps back to the origin. So this is an example of world space. World space is basically measuring the distance from the origin, or 0, 0, 0, to your object. So if I take this, the peppermint patty that I've created and I do the same thing, it goes back to the origin. So again, that's literally just the object's distance from the origin. Local space happens if you parent stuff together. So if I take this, this cube and I parent it under my peppermint patty, you'll notice actually that, so let me undo that really quick. Well, that's terrifying. All right, let me undo that a lot. Okay, that was weird. All right, so right now, this is still in world space. It is not parented under my peppermint patty. And you'll notice that the translate x is like -117 units. If I now go ahead and parent this under my peppermint patty, you'll notice that the square, instead of being like 119 or whatever it was, it's now -9, and it has a translate x value, which it didn't have before at all. It also, for some reason, has acquired rotation values, which is strange and interesting. I'm actually, in this case, not sure why that happened, but what this means, like, does anybody know or want to take a guess, like, why those numbers changed? Yeah.
Because it's now treating the sphere as the origin.
Yeah. Right. So whenever you parent an object under another object, it measures the distance from that parent object instead of from the origin. So whatever these weird values are is actually like the distance from this peppermint patty. Which means, and this is like kind of helpful sometimes if you're like setting up rigging or like doing other things, if you parent an object and then zero it out, it should snap down right to the center of this other object, which is really helpful if you have like a joint and you want to or if you have like a ball and socket joint and you want a little joint situated perfectly inside that, you can do the same thing. It works 97% of the time. Parent it and then zero it out. It should snap to whatever object you want, and then you can just go ahead. So again, right now this square is like zeroed out in relation to this peppermint patty. I'll shift P to unparent that, and you'll notice that now it has translation values again, and that's because since it's not parented, it's measuring the distance to the origin. You can also, it's actually, the square and the patty should have the exact same values for the translation because they're now in the same spot. That's basically world versus local space. Anybody have questions about that? Okay. So again, not directly relating to rigging, but it is kind of helpful sometimes, like if you ever need to like cleverly snap things together. and it can be helpful for setting up your joints in like really specific like ball and socket joints. So that is like more or less the hardcore basics of like what a joint chain is and how the joints relate to each other, but you will notice, like if I grab joint 3 and I go ahead and zero this out, it goes and it snaps itself into the exact same spot as joint 2. And it's basically, again, because these joints are all parented together, they're operating under local space. So these translate values kind of need to stay there if you want the joint to stay the same length. So if you zero them out, you're just going to get like a pile of joints right on top of each other. So again, rotation values, evil on so many levels. Translate values, totally normal. Other weird thing, I'm not going to talk about a lot today. If you're curious, if you go into your attribute editor and you select a joint, so here's all your transform attributes, the same you'd find in your channel box. There's also some extra ones, and there's like joint orient. These are basically just sort of like settings for the joint that are like hidden and not super relevant to the user. You can modify them if you want to. I'll show you guys how to do some of that stuff later. But these joints technically do kind of have some rotation on them. It's just like you don't need to worry about the rotation in this particular box. Just a weird fun fact. But in your channel box, there should be no rotation. All right. So any questions about sort of joints or anything like that before I just sort of jump into like, let's actually make this dude kind of move? All right. So usually when you're starting a rig, it's not a bad idea to start with more or less like the center of gravity for the character. On a human, and you guys should all be doing humanoid stuff, does anybody know kind of where the center of gravity is? Yeah. Yep. Right, so it is pretty much the hips. It's not pretty much the hips, it is the hips. If you move your hips, your legs are going to go with it. It's also going to take the top of your body. So this is where we're going to basically make our first joint, or like have the joint that, if we move that joint, it moves all of the other joints. So I'm just going to go into my skeleton menu again and do create joints. And this time I will actually open up the settings. The only thing that this does, I mean, you can change some other stuff in here, but usually why I go in here is to look at the short bone radius. I'm just going to set this to something like 6 and 10. And all this is doing, it's not affecting how the joints work, it's just affecting how you view them on the screen. So if I click now, it's going to give me like physically larger displays of joints, so hopefully you guys can actually see them. They're not tiny sad sticks. So that's like literally all that is. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit, interesting, for the create joint button again. I tried G, and for some reason that put another sphere in my scene. So we have this joint 1, and usually the fun thing is if you're doing like a human body, it's more important where this is placed because it functions more as like the actual hip. Since this is just a solid object, it kind of doesn't matter as much because there's no deformations that this is really like affecting. It's just like one piece of geometry attached to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this my root joint. And I also do realize that this is probably like terrible to look at right now. So if you don't like looking at joints on a wireframe, which I don't think anybody does, if you go into right above the viewport in this little shading menu and just turn on X-ray joints. What this is going to do is if it'll show your joint basically through your person so you can actually see it. Can you guys all see this joint right now?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so we have our first joint. We have basically, if you look at the setup of this dude, sort of 2 moving parts, I guess, in this torso. And they all kind of rotate around the same, more or less the same areas. Like this should be rotating directly from in the sphere, and the sphere should be rotating directly in place. So we need to set up joints to accommodate that. And kind of like I mentioned last week a little bit in terms of like how to make your models, we're going to throw a joint directly in the center of this sphere. So I'm, again, just going to go to skeleton, create joints. I'll turn on my little temporary wireframe so I can sort of like place that there. And you do want to ensure that this is actually centered in your object. So I'm just going to really quick make this like slightly offset. Like it kind of looks correct if you're not looking at the wireframe, but it's not quite. And I'll just go ahead and attach this really quick, just like really quick and dirty. Parent. So if I grab this joint and I rotate it around, this is actually, I don't think I made this like extreme enough of a difference, but if my tolerances on this were tighter, you would notice it start to sort of like clip through other pieces of the geometry at some point because it's not totally centered. But apparently my design is very, very forgiving for that. So that was a not super fantastic example. Cough. But you should, like I said, line everything up as best you can. So I'm just going to grab my joint and use V to vertex snap it right to the center of this. And I'll just double check and make sure that it is also centered on the other side of this character, if I can figure out my hotkeys. All right, so it's centered, so we should be good. And what I'm actually going to do, I tested this. This is like weird. I don't usually have to do this, but so we need this ball rotating in place exactly where it is, and we need this thing pivoting from the center of this ball. So what I'm actually going to do is take this joint that I just made, this little joint 1 here, and I'm going to duplicate it so we have 2 joints in the exact same position. And I'm just going to call this one torso ball and chest. And basically I should be good to more or less start like hooking stuff up and like attaching them in the outliner. So what I'm going to do, right now these are all just separate joints. If I move one, it's not going to move the other, which hopefully if you move your hips, it takes the rest of you with it. That's ideally what happens. So what I'm going to do is parent these like the original joint chain I sort of demoed on was parented. So I'm going to take the chest, parent that under the torso ball, and take torso ball and put that under the root joint. So notice these are all connected now. If I move the root, it's going to take the rest of them with it, etc. Any questions so far? All right. So from there, I'm going to turn on X-ray joints again. We should be good to start attaching geometry. And in the case of a robot, there's sort of 3 ways to do it. One, and I do not recommend doing this because it will make your life terrible, is literally just parenting geometry to your joints. Don't do that. It's not a good way to do stuff. And then there's 2 other options you can do. So one is actually constraining the geometry. So has anybody not gone over constraints before? Okay. So I'll go over these, like, I guess a little bit more in future weeks. More of a demo of, like, specifically what they do. But basically, there's 2 ways to attach stuff to a rig. One is to use skinning, which is like skin binds skin. It's just sort of like I don't even know how to describe it. It's basically you can use it to like paint influences on a model. So like you have a bunch of different joints that control one model and like make it bend. So something like a human where it's like one piece with multiple joints in it is you would want to use bind skin. For something like this robot, all I really want is this piece to follow this joint, and I don't need it to be fancy. Like there's no other joints controlling this piece, so I'll use a constraint. And again, I'll go over all of this kind of later. I'm just kind of like doing like an intro to like setting up joints and stuff. But basically, if you select your chest joint, select your, what am I doing? I'm hitting all the wrong buttons. Select chest joint, select piece of geometry you want to follow it, and then go to constrain. And I'm going to do a parent constraint for this. So there's different types of constraints. Point constraint is for translation. Orient is for rotate. Scale. Aim is cool. I'll go over that more later. And parent is, if you open the settings, which is not super necessary, but it's translate and rotate at the same time. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. And theoretically now, if I move my chest joint, it should take this little chest geometry with it. And you'll notice again, because the joint setup is in the center of the ball, it rotates perfectly and it doesn't end up like clipping through unless I do something really crazy like that. But that's sort of like the basic idea of how to attach these. And again, I'll go over like skinning and like constraints more explicitly in the future. But are there any questions so far? All right. So I'm just going to go through. So you'll actually notice if I move the chest joint, nothing is happening to that middle ball, and that's, in this case, what I'm actually shooting for. So I'll grab my torso ball joint, grab the actual little ball, constrain, parent, and now when I grab this and I move it, it's going to take both the ball and the little piece of chest geometry with it. And this is exactly what I want it to do, because again, it's how the joints are attached together or like parented together affects the geometry that it's moving. So when I move this ball, it takes the chest joint with it. I can then at this point go through and like do some weird motions with the chest if I want, and sort of move things that way. But that is like more or less honestly how you set up like most of the rig. So in this case, like you might just need to do a little bit of experimenting with like what gives you the desired effect for your chain. Like I said, normally I don't have to nest joints inside of each other like this. That's actually like a really weird thing that I don't think I've ever had to do on a rig before. And then if you sort of go up, I'll do the legs this week and do the arms cough when I have arms cough. But same thing for the neck. So you just want like a little joint within this bottom piece, another one coming up here, and that would control the head, that kind of thing. So basically anywhere you would have a joint on like a human body or in your robot, you should put some kind of joint to control however that's bending. All right. And I also do recommend that as you work, you rename your joints. Otherwise, it's going to get real confusing real fast. You're going to have like many, many joints, and if you don't label them, you're going to cry. All right, so setting up legs is, and again, if you guys have questions, feel free to stop me. I just can't see any raised hands from where I'm sitting. So legs is pretty much the same basic premise as what we've been doing before. So I'm just going to do create joints again, and just sort of throw them somewhere I think it maybe would make sense for them to be. And you can go back and forth. They're always created on a plane by default, so either like, you know, basically flat on the ground or like flat on one of these orthographic planes. If you want them somewhere else, you have to sort of move them manually into place after you create them. So again, we have a leg chain. We need these joints to actually be centered. And in this case, my geometry supports that. Good. So what I'm able to do is just grab this joint, V for vertex snapping, and just sort of pop that right into place. It's also not a terrible idea to make sure that you didn't actually like snap it to the front of your leg or something insane, because sometimes that happens. And then I'm just going to really quick sort of go down my leg and do all of these. So you'll notice in this centerpiece of the leg, I set up this sort of like one piece of geometry that's sort of like the center of this pivot. And that was just sort of a thing that I did. I knew I was going to need it, so I just sort of put it there in the geometry. So I'll just snap my joint to that. Control that. And then V to vertex snap that just like to the center of that leg. Strictly speaking, it could be anywhere. Like this is just a hinge joint. So it really only makes a difference on this one axis where it's positioned. It just kind of looks nicer in the center of the leg. And then you basically just kind of go down and keep doing that again for like all of these joints, which I'm not gonna like subject you guys to watching me do that. So basically orient stuff or like position things where you need them, and then go through and relabel everything. And I would highly recommend, so like when you're labeling, especially stuff like legs or arms where like presumably you have two of them in your rig, go through, it doesn't matter what your naming convention is, but figure out some kind of naming convention to differentiate left from right. So I just like doing like L underscore or R underscore because I think it's small and it's easy to deal with. If you wanted to, you could call the entire left side of your person banana and the whole right side bagels. It will not hurt your rig, it'll just hurt my soul. But you can do it. I tried to do that with coding once, and I made all my variables like banana, bagel, food name, and I'm like, why did I do this? It was awful. But the reason that it's good to have a obvious naming convention, I mean, apart from just like being clear to look at, is we have the right side of this person set up. I'm just gonna call it left for now. And we have the exact same shapes and geometry on the other side of this person. We actually don't need to set these joints up twice. What we can do is use a tool it's super helpful. It's called like mirror joints. So if you select the skeleton that you want to mirror over and go up to skeleton, mirror joints. And this one, do usually open the settings for. What you're gonna do, I'll just show you what it does by default. So if I just hit apply, you can see that it's actually just mirrored over that geometry. It'll just flip it right across the axes in the center of your, in Maya. So if you should ideally line everything up like on a central axis, so it's not like shoved way off to a corner. Otherwise, this won't work. But it's just flipped it, so now I don't need to make them on that second side of the body. You will notice that like right now it's just sort of like L hip 1 and L hip, and that's kind of like this tool is more powerful than that. So what you can do is there's like this search for and replace with functions the same thing as like a Word document tool. Take like whatever your like L underscore is and replace it with whatever you want to name the other side of your rig. In this case, just R underscore. Whoops. Select your joints and hit apply. And you'll notice it mirrors it again, but it's also gone through and relabeled these all from like L hip, L knee, L ankle to R hip, R knee, R ankle. So save you a lot of time renaming, especially when you get to stuff like human fingers, where there's like a crap ton of a lot of joints in them, and it sucks to rename them all by hand. So that's the mirror joints tool, super handy. One thing I will say is, no, that's gonna break things. So like I said, you can do this. I just don't recommend it. But if you're ever doing something with this tool and it like, if you get the wrong axis to start with, like if I do this and hit apply and it's like, well, this is clearly not what I wanted, just undo it, delete those extra joints, and just pick a new axis and try a new one. It almost never does what I want the first time around. But that's the mirror joints tool, so I'm going to go ahead and set this back to something less ridiculous. I think I'm just hungry. All right, so we have our hips. And this is basically like same process that you do for the leg, you're going to do for the arm, just going to add some extra fingers. But what we have is essentially two separate weird leg rigs, like two just individual skeletons for legs, and then this little skeleton for the root. So what we want to do is attach these together, and I'll show you like the sort of simple way to do it, where you get like basic functionality, and then I'll show you a little bit, like one extra joint you can pop in to make things a little bit more modular. So easiest thing to do is just grab your hips and throw them under your root joint. So you'll notice at this point, if you can see the root joint, it has all of the skeletons or like these sort of little arrows pointing away from it. That's saying basically like this is the center of everything. So if I move this, it's going to take the legs, the top of the body, etc. The downside of this is that if I want to just move the hips, like if I don't want to rotate the entire body at once, there's no great way to do that. So if you move the root, it's taking the legs with it automatically, and there's no way to just like pop one hip up slightly. So again, there's a one joint solution to fix that. Does anybody happen to want to take a guess or like what that is? Is that okay? Cool. That's fair. I think I went over this last quarter, but I could be losing my mind. I have no idea. Basically, it's just duplicate your root joint or put a joint in the exact same spot. So I'll just duplicate it and get rid of everything under it. And I will just call this pelvis. So this is going to be basically what I attach my legs to. So I'll grab my left and right hips, put them under my pelvis, and you can see that now it's not connected to my root at all, but I have this like weird control I can use where I can just like flip the hips around really crazily without moving the upper part of the body. And what I can do is just take this pelvis and put it under my root joint. So if I want to, I can tilt the entire body. And I also have the ability by selecting this pelvis control to move only the hips at once. So I would highly recommend doing that. It just gives you a little bit of extra functionality. Honestly, I barely ever use the pelvis for anything. I like counter keying against the root because I feel like for me it makes the motions easier to deal with or like more realistic. But every once in a while, it's nice to have that pelvis where you just like pop it up a little bit and get a little bit of extra motion out of the hips without dealing with the stuff above. So that is like the pretty sort of like basic setup of like legs on a human. Are there any questions on that? Or like any other sort of basic rigging stuff? Again, I'll probably cover a lot of the stuff kind of like next week we go over some more advanced things. All right. In that case, I think this is like pretty much as far as I got with my last class, so I'm just gonna leave this and say you guys are free to wander off. Don't forget you have 3 assignments and the orthographics are due Friday before next class. Have a lovely week.